Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 7. We are in our second to last week now, and it's kind of amazing to try to process how fast the semester has flown by. So, just an announcement that the final paper prompt is now posted under week 8. Next week, you will have your last discussion post, in addition to your last reaction post and the final paper, which will be due on Friday. And then we will be wrapped up with the semester. Feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. Before then, there is a tight turnaround time with grading, so you do want to make sure that you reach out well before, honestly, next week if you want to discuss anything pertaining to the class. So with that said, this week we'll be talking about institutions and specifically looking at one institution in particular, which are prison systems, the criminal justice system. And this is actually my area of specialty. My dissertation research is looking at the connection between trauma and the prison industrial complex. And so I'm super excited to share the lecture this week. And in this lecture, the mini lecture, I will be briefly going over what my dissertation is about and talking about my research to all of you. So in my study, I explore the role of what's known as urban criminalization, or the process in which people or certain acts are turned into criminals or criminal acts within urban spaces, such as the inner city and under-resourced communities. And I examine young men and women of color in a urban area. It was actually here in Connecticut. And I seek to understand the ways in which young people may define, experience, recover, and resist trauma. Papa, stop it. He's over there looking at the counter. Resist trauma, or what's known as structural traumatization in their communities. So oftentimes when we think about violence and the impacts, for instance, of abuse have been studied on children, for instance, who grow up in domestic violence, or children who have been sexually assaulted, the impact of that is well documented. There are many who experience a range of mental health issues because of these experiences. And we tend to think of violence sometimes as something very interpersonal, something that's happening between two people. Well, within sociology, there is this concept known as structural violence. And essentially, that is a kind of violence that doesn't necessarily always result in physical harm, though it can. In the case of police brutality, such as somebody, saying, "I can't breathe," and not having the officer, get off of them. Right? There's a range of examples. It can be less physical though, right? And it can be symbolic even. And we can think about the way poverty might be a form of structural violence. Or we can think about the way that having a home raided as a child could be potentially a form of violence. And so in my dissertation, that's what I was interested in understanding. How had people experienced, right, this structural violence or this symbolic violence through exchanges with the police in both their community and their homes? And so I talked to 30 or so people to get their experiences about what that had been like for them. And I was not surprised to find that for many of these youth, they had been traumatized. They had experienced a number of different incidents, whether that be home raids, being detained unrightfully. There's just a lot of different examples that kind of came out of the data where people were sharing their stories and saying, this is really personally impacted me. And what then I studied, or continued to analyze rather, was how does this expand beyond the individual to the whole family, to even the community, right? So what role, right, if the police are designed to protect and serve, who are they protecting and serving, and from who, right? And how then can imprisonment actually be violent? And this also visits, it's a critical inquiry, into criminalization and the criminal justice system. And there is a historical background that I provide as well, looking at plantations, this is research that's already documented the way that plantations that once existed have now been replaced with prison systems. There's this phenomenal book by the name of The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander that really documents the ways that all of the old ways we used to oppress people of color have been in many ways replaced with the prison industrial complex. And so I essentially look at both public space and private space to analyze how is policing kind of entering these intimate spaces and disrupting education, employment, housing security, and the list goes on. And so in particular though, and in relation to our course, really beginning to think of like, what are the mental health impacts of imprisonment on an individual? And the book really talks about this from an interesting perspective about all of the ways that mental health kind of leads to and kind of may reproduce this process of criminalization and incarceration. And I'm more so kind of interested in specifically focusing on the mental health consequences of this, right? So revisiting the initial point that if the prison system is operating in such a way that there is symbolic violence, then what are the actual impacts on a whole community, right? And how can we think about now depression not just as something an individual may experience, right? But again, getting into that racialized analysis, getting into our class analysis and connecting all of those factors. And so my dissertation is going to kind of break this up into a few different exciting chapters. One of them is specifically going to look at the research site and really provide a in-depth like kind of analysis of the place, what's happening there, what is this community really like? And it's really important because this study is specifically analyzing how place really does mediate people's experiences with the police and also mental health issues and you know, as a result of that. And so I'm really going to begin to look at the ecology. What is the ecology that kind of contextualizes policing in people's everyday lives? Then the next chapter is going to look at state violence and what's known as legalized crime, or what I'm calling it, because oftentimes the research tends to emphasize crime that's committed by individual actors. And so in this chapter, I essentially look at the way that crimes against humanity also qualify as crime, right? And how at times these systems that reproduce crimes against humanity do not necessarily get checked, right? Because the systems that are responsible for catching crime may ignore their own, right? And then in the next chapter, I look at public space and then and in the final chapter, I look at private space and explore how policing extends into not only the public sphere, but the private sphere, and into youth's homes, and the way that that impacts family, the way that being separated from a parent at an early age may impact a youth, or the financial strain that that could put on a home, and then therefore some of the class kind of inequalities that are connected to mental health outcomes. And so this research is deeply inspired by my kind of moral priorities or obligations to human rights, to equality and social justice. And doing the interviews was very moving and kind of inspired me, and what I'm hoping to is that this research can again go into informing good policy and good practices that ultimately can improve the quality of people's lives and the structural factors that do impact our mental health, right, and how we are doing. And you know, going back to the one video that we watched earlier in the semester about, you know, it's no measure of health to be well adapted to a sick society. We can do everything we can in our personal kind of arsenal or toolkit to try to stay well. However, that is always ultimately going to be mediated by the environments we are in. And so a hope of mine is to continue to work towards more humane policies and practices, specifically when it comes to youth in communities of color who are being policed, and thinking about the implications that has for them in the present and also in the long term. So with that said, my cat is on the counter and should not be. I am super excited to share this research. I'm looking forward to reading your final papers and wrapping up our semester next week. So thanks again, and see you all soon.